Hello and welcome. I'm Raul Fernandez, Select Board Member and Chair of the Task Force to Reimagine Policing in Brookline. This is our Task Force meeting for Friday, November 20th, 2020. We have a very full agenda today. There's opportunity for any remarks from members of the task force. I'll share some remarks in a moment. We'll be approving some meeting minutes, another update on our policing survey, and a really important discussion on traffic stop data that'll be led by Brookline's former police chief, Dan O'Leary, and opportunities for updates if there are any from the subcommittees and any new business. So I just wanted to actually start before we begin by recognizing that many of us, staff included, may be bleary-eyed from multiple nights of town meeting, but that we're also making incredible progress there. We're about halfway into what's expected to be a 6-night town meeting, and we've already passed some really big progressive warrant articles. For instance, we expanded low-income tenant representation on our Housing Advisory Board from 1 to 3 members, adding even more voices to those most impacted by affordable housing policy. By the way, we're still the only board in the Commonwealth that requires any tenant representation, and now we have 3 tenant reps on that board. We expanded our inclusionary zoning bylaw to produce even more permanently affordable homes and to add much needed cash to our depleted housing trust fund. We passed a property tax exemption that will allow fixed income seniors, mostly single women, to afford to age in place without abandoning their homes. We updated our general and zoning bylaws to include gender neutral language, affirming the lived experiences of our non-binary neighbors and visitors. And this one I think is especially big. We banned the practice of requiring plaintiffs to sign non-disclosure agreements with the town as a condition of settlement in cases of racial or gender discrimination or police misconduct. No more silencing victims. And we did it all with impressive majorities, often disregarding the recommendations of our more conservative select board, yours truly excluded, of course. Props and thanks to all those town meeting members and community advocates who have shown that real change can be accomplished when we come together, put policy over platitudes, and step up for those who need it most. That's exactly what we're endeavoring to do here. And while it may seem like the road to change is long and littered with roadblocks, because it is, let's also remember that Brookline is a community that's ready for progress. So let's continue our work of producing bold, imaginative, and workable proposals, feeling hopeful that there's a body out there that's ready to consider them. So let's get to it. Any other thoughts or announcements from members of the task force or our staff?
I'm going to jump in here, Raul, because I don't want to belabor this as well as there was an email last night to record our committee meeting. That email came out at almost 7:45, and to stream it on Big. That makes me super uncomfortable. It has made Officer Keneally super uncomfortable. I don't think we're having that meeting now. And I would just say, we have to give 48 hours before we actually post a meeting. Right. If we're going to record and Zoom on and stream through Big, just as a task force member, I want to know that with more notice. I didn't truly read that email until this morning. Right. I saw it come through. If I had little kids or anything like that, I definitely wouldn't have read it until this morning. And so I think it looks bad for us, honestly. I mean, I do. And so I'm gonna put it out there. We can, again, I don't feel prepared to hash it out. I know it's not an agenda item, but I know you were at the diversity inclusion where there was some pushback in a lot of ways. I don't know what any resolutions came to any of those. Yeah. But I mean, I think we might have lost an opportunity because of trying to stream and video record. So
yeah. Well, let me hear from Alexander first if you have something on this.
Was this a subcommittee meeting or this meeting, or just give me some context?
Subcommittee.
Yeah, so I wanted to briefly apologize for my own part in that. I completely agree, Malcolm. And I wasn't really thinking about that. Raul and I were conferring earlier in the week about whether it would be possible to record it, and I was like, I can't record it because of my BU account. I should have been thinking it through at that point and sending it out to the rest of the subcommittee and to Caitlin Keneally to see if that was something she would even be comfortable with, regardless of technical. I think you're right.
Yeah, so I mean, if you need to go ahead and go forward the meeting without it being recorded, please do, Malcolm. Don't want to stand in the way of that, certainly. I will say this much about the recording of public meetings, that all of our meetings, including our subcommittee meetings, are public. Whether or not we record them, if a member of the public was present, all they need to do in order to record the meeting, whether in person or these virtual meetings, is to inform the chair that they will be recording the meeting, and not to ask permission to record the meeting, because it is the right of the public to record public meetings. So it rarely happens. I feel like it happened, occasionally when we were all in person for subcommittee meetings, for committee meetings. It does rarely happen, but it is. But so we should know that it's always a possibility that any one of our public meetings could be recorded. But that said, if there's someone that is uncomfortable being recorded, I certainly wouldn't want to thrust that upon them.
I mean, I get that, and I know that rule, but I think, again, and one of the things I push back, like, there may be times where that's actually not appropriate. And I use, like, my very weak legal understanding of, at times, like, we clear a court for certain testimonies and make sure that, the public can't see them. And so I think what I've witnessed is when people have stood up and said they're going to start recording, sometimes, especially when we have people who are coming to give testimony, they then decide they're not doing it.
Yeah.
And they're not held to the same requirement as we are as a part of a task force. Right. They're visiting to come and help us out. And so, yeah, I think I think we need to understand that as well. That if I were going to perhaps pour my guts or put something on the line, and it was sort of coming in this idea that it's through the task force subcommittee, as opposed to an individual citizen saying it, I think, I think we just have to realize that may actually detract from people talking to us. It might make some people want to talk to us, but it may also detract from some people talking to us.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page in principle. I think there was just some miscommunication here, so we can make sure we fix that for the next time around.
This is Devin. I'll also add that it is not BIG's policy to record subcommittee meetings or stream them, because it's that would obviously be a 24/7 operation for them. So this was just a special case because I think a couple members of the task force wanted to be able to watch this particular recording and weren't going to be able to. So that is, again, this is not the norm. This was an accommodation that they had made for us, but it is very reversible. They don't need to stream or record the meeting if the subcommittee does not want to do that.
Good. Okay. Anything else on this or other matters before we launch into our agenda? All right. So next is the question of approving the meeting minutes from Friday, November 13th. I trust everyone's sent any edits if they have any. Do you have any edits you'd like to discuss live before we vote? Okay, let's go ahead and take that vote. Remember to unmute yourselves. So this is a motion to approve the minutes from Friday, November 13th. Ann Weaver.
Yes.
Eitan.
Yes.
Almas.
Yes.
Kristen.
Yes.
Bonnie.
Yes.
Alexander.
Yes.
Mike.
Yes.
Kimberly.
Yes.
Malcolm.
Yes.
Ichi.
Yes.
And the chair votes yes. Okay, great. Didn't miss anyone, did I? No. Okay, policing survey update. I think this is a quick one. We gave them a thorough update last time around. Eitan, I believe these surveys should be hitting folks in mailboxes sometime very soon.
Yeah, they're coming. Yeah, I think that's right. By next week, we should be hearing from people I just wanted to reemphasize that there's so many people who are going to get these. We are very likely to get a number of people saying, what is this? Either calling the select board, contacting Professor Schaffner, he'll forward that stuff to us, but we should see that next week. So, we might expect 100 or so even kind of questions, complaints, stuff like that. But that's just, par for the course with this kind of thing.
Great. I'll just note a press release went out through the town. I mentioned it at our select board meeting just yesterday. And also, Chi-Chi, I saw that you sent the sort of just the notice out to the Brookline Asian American Family Network list. Others might have been doing the same. And so if you are on various lists, if you can encourage folks to complete that survey, that'll be really, really helpful.
Actually, let's put this in the official minutes. Anytime something like that happens, that someone, particularly from our task force or from the town, sends a communication to a subgroup of this town, we should note that in our report. I think it helps reflect on how we got response rates, how response rates might vary by community. So let's just make all those things official so we can track them.
Mutual Aid Brookline, I believe, put it out in the community notes on Friday.
I asked the school and Steps Inc. leaders to notify that well, two things, that we were sending a survey and there was another one coming from the reform, to note that their communities were going to be hit with two different surveys. I asked them to communicate that. I don't know if they did, but I asked them to.
Great. Anyone else? If you do, maybe just if you send it something out anywhere else, maybe if you want to blind copy myself or Devin, or just send us an email to let us know that you did, we can make sure that we include that as part of sort of that list of outreach. So just, either way, just let us know.
If the police department or the union sends something out to folks, can we be made aware of that?
This
Dan,
is
I think
valid.
you do.
Yes. I don't think that they will, but if they do, we'll know about it and we'll share it with this group.
Great.
Terrific. Okay, let's move on to our discussion on traffic stop data. This is going to be the first in a two-part discussion. Dan has shared with us some data that should be in our packets around traffic stops and citations for the last 2 years, 2019 and 2018, and we'll talk about that today. There are some other questions about what I was calling before additional action, anything else that happens, someone, that ended up having a warrant or there was a vehicle search, those kinds of things. We're going to have a deeper discussion on those issues at our December 4th meeting, which I believe is December 4th, that the Friday after Thanksgiving, which is going to be our next full task force meeting after this meeting. We'll have that discussion, but let's go ahead and start here. Dan, do you want to take it away?
Sure. I'll just provide a quick outline of the documents that you got sent and some context of where they all came from. And Raul was correct when he said that this is first of a two-part. The way we record these documents is actually the reason why it's going to come out in two parts. I think we wanted to get the information out to the committee ahead of time, but there's also additional information that has to get pulled by hand. And we're going to try to accomplish that. So what you have in front of you are mostly pulled from our Laserfish system. When we started recording these traffic stops and all of our statistics, we don't have a computer program linked to Larimore, which is our computer system, that can handle all of this. Each officer gives, when he or she pulls somebody over, obviously gives a ticket. That ticket is recorded. The ticket puts on it, amongst other things, the chapter and section of the violations that they're going to charge, whether it's a warning, court, a civil infraction, a criminal complaint, or an arrest. And so all that documents have to be, all of that information and the document itself actually has to be entered by hand into the Laserfiche system, where it's taking a picture of it. After that is done, and we have been doing it for the past several years that way, the supervisor, the civilian supervisor in traffic, then brings out the documentation, takes out what information and puts them in the spreadsheets. We asked them initially to do all of the citations, like Raul said. He did it, and I'll go through them. They're broken down by citation, by offense, by sex and race. And then we gave you the department information for those 2 years as well, and percentages. So in order to do what happens after a stop, whether an arrest is made based on a warrant or a revoked license, that information has to be pulled by hand. The Neil Harrington, who is the supervisor, is currently doing it now. He hopes to have it done sometime next week. We also had a request earlier from Malcolm about trying to determine the locations of the stops. I plan on talking to Neil later this morning and seeing if he can do that as well. There was also a request to see if we could take a look at just Brookline residents. I don't know the answer to that, but I'll find out. And if we can, we'll try to get all the documentation in to the committee like the Wednesday before, December 2nd. So that's just a little bit of the background. But if you saw the information, it got put into the packets last night. There's 5 different categories that are covered. We did if you take the first one, it'd be the 2018 citations. You have a couple of different charts in there, and that's just strictly by the first column is on the left is a chapter and section, and then it's broken down as to each ticket, what it gives. If you go to the bottom, you can then pick to go by race, and then there's another write-up in there, another document in there that has red lines in it, and that's the breakdown of the race of the subject that was stopped. It will have an arrest was made or not, a civil infraction, which is such things as a red light or speeding, a criminal complaint, which is a little bit more like an unregistered, uninsured car, something like that, leaving the scene of an accident, and then the category of warning, and then the total citations issued for those offenses. You'll see in the left-hand column, it's all chapter and section, and that's done internally. Well, officers are required to put it on the ticket, but also to account for everybody's handwriting. It's easier to read the numbers than it is the actual offenses that they put down in there. So there was a decision made in traffic that when we provide these documents, we will provide them based on the chapter and section. So you have those two, one for 2019 are together, and for 2018 are together. And then if we come forward to the next section, we break it down by department, by the department, and that would be the 2018 and 2019. It's called FAPE, Fair and Impartial Policing, and those are broken out by race and sex, and then the total number of stops based on platoons. Platoons are the day shift, which is 7:20 to 3:30. Second platoon is 3:30 to 11:30. Third platoon is 11:30 to 7:20. And that's broken down by race, sex, percentage, warnings, and they're pretty well self-explanatory in there. Finally, the fifth document that you got explains what each one of the chapter and sections mean. So we didn't take the time to try to write that out for each ticket. We thought if you're interested in finding out when you see something that brings your attention to it, you can go to that booklet and find out what the charges are. If you see down that left-hand column that there is more than one chapter and section, like say you get chapter 90-17 and chapter 90-10, that's two offenses. One of them, 90-17, is a speeding offense. 90-10, I think, is a license offense. So you'll see two offenses on there. And then it will go how many people were stopped and charged with that. And that's just a quick overview of it. We had some discussion yesterday at the subcommittee meeting, and a lot of it kind of boiled down to, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of boiled down to is, what do we compare Brookline statistics to see where Brookline stands as far as providing a fair and impartial traffic enforcement? Well, we talked about a couple of things. One was to compare them to the census data for Brookline. And I would say that I don't think that's the correct one, because many, many more people than the ones that reside in here drive through here. And I, to be honest with you, I don't think anybody has, well, I haven't seen what is the accurate way of doing it. It's been done by just your town census by people. It's also been done by the town in some surrounding areas, some surrounding parts of city of Boston, because of where Brookline's situated. And I don't mean that as a negative thing. It's a fact of life. People drive from Brighton, go through Brookline to go somewhere, and vice versa. A lot of people visit. Route 9 is backed up every morning, going into town, and then every evening going out of town. So there's a lot of people that come through here. We do have an active traffic enforcement. One of our highest complaints is traffic. But if you take a look at what the numbers, the breakdown of complaints or court issues versus warnings, every racial category has over 80% of the tickets is warnings. And that's, I think, is based on the officer's discretion, what he or she sees and what they think of the violation. All that documentation is in there. I think I would stop at that point and see if there's questions, or I can answer questions as best I could. We've been doing these release of these stats since 1997. Our stats go back that far. We have participated in a couple of studies, one in 2000 when the law came in 2004 to record racial profiling stats. We were already doing it for 8 years at that point. No big deal for us. At 2008, we joined a study with Northeastern on it. They did windshield surveys on cars, vehicles that came through. Their windshield surveys were a group of graduate students at various locations in town from, I think it was like 7:30 in the morning to 7 in the morning, 6:30 in the morning to 9:30. And then I think it was the evening as well. It was like 4 to 7, something like that, where they recorded people that drove through there and what their perceptions were of the race and sex of the person driving. The results of that came out that there was probably, and I don't have it in front of me, so I'm going by memory. It's about between 11 and 12% African Americans are Black. It was about 5 or 6% Hispanic or Latino. It was probably, I don't remember the Middle Eastern, and the vast majority obviously was white coming through town. That study has never been replicated. We did try to do it on a number of occasions, but we just never pulled it off. So those numbers haven't been updated since about 2009. So I'm open for conversation, questions, and comments. And I know it's late getting to you, but you'll have 2 weeks to go over things.
Okay, let's, I see Ann Weaver. Go first.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Chief.
Thanks.
Are there quotas involved with traffic stops for Brookline police officers? Are they, I've heard that through the grapevine, but in terms of how many stops, how many violations traffic officers are expected to give out, et cetera?
No, that we've never set a quota. I think that it's clear that we have emphasized traffic enforcement based on the needs of the community and the fact that we're a commuter town. And when a complaint comes in, we expect it to be handled. That I know that Ron Wilkerson was looking at our computer system, and there's a system in there called the STARS program, and the STARS program actually tracks neighbor complaints. Just to talk a little bit about neighbor complaints, we don't go in, and we haven't gone in say the last 10 or so years when a complaint comes in about speeding and try enforcement right away. What we do is we have a counter where we'll put tubes across the roadway, and they will measure the speed and the volume of cars that go through there for a 24-hour period. We'll analyze it and then have a discussion with the complainant to see if in fact the speeding complaint is valid in that neighborhood. I know we were doing that before I left. I'm assuming it's still going on now.
I'm basing this on a interview that somebody posted earlier this year in September in the townwide Facebook group of a Brookline police officer saying that he felt that there was a numbers-driven approach to policing in Brookline, and that was concerning to him. So that's why I'm asking about quotas. And I'm also wondering about field interviews. Is there any kind of expectation around how many field interviews should be happening? Any sort of quota involved in that? Any kind of, maybe not even overt expectation, but a sort of pervasive kind of feeling in the police force that you need to be stopping X number of people for field interviews?
I think that they're two separate issues. I would say that people shouldn't even have a perception that an officer shouldn't have a perception that we're out there telling them to stop people that are walking down the street to get a number. I will admit that we have told officers that there's a speeding complaint, or there's a stoplight complaint, or there's some kind of a complaint in your neighborhood, and the neighbors are upset, and we want it to end. And I also think that it's not a bad thing to have this is my opinion, it's not a bad thing to have an aggressive traffic enforcement. It increases the safety in the town and safety of the roads. And it's always been in the back of my mind that is probably the #1 complaint from residents, something to do with traffic or parking. It's a long way of saying I never told anybody a number. I have told people that we expect them to do some police activity, and of which that is one of them. If they perceive that as certain amount of tickets, I don't agree with that. I never used a number, but I did tell them they had to do some work.
So Chief, if while you were chief, if you noticed an officer that was simply not submitting tickets at the same level as others, is it fair to say you might question whether or not they were out there doing their job? Is that a different way to think about this?
Not particularly, because it depends on a lot of things. It depends on their assignment.
Okay.
It depends on what's going on and what it is. I mean, if a crime is going on, criminal activity, say there's a crime spree, of course traffic is going to take a backseat. Of course your number is going to go down. Your all-night parking tickets are going to go down, because if they're happening on the last half, we're reassigning the people to where the crime's taking place. So it all depends on the situation. I think that people probably did have the impression that if we put them in an area that there's a complaint, that we want some activity from them. It didn't mean that they had to give a complaint, as you can see by the high number of warnings that we do. But it's not bad to stop somebody and tell them what they're doing is wrong in the neighborhood to increase the safety. It's a balance. I know it's a balance, and I know it's been an issue a lot of people talk about, but the alternative is you turn your back on it, and then accidents may go up. People may get hurt. And I don't think that's what the people want. Could be wrong, but that was how I approached it.
Sure thing. Let me ask you something that we mentioned at the departmental analysis subcommittee meeting. A couple of us noticed in the 2019 annual report that traffic stops were up year over year from 2018 by 48%, which kind of stood out to a couple of us. Do you? And I know that wasn't. I think that wasn't during your time, 2019. No, it certainly wasn't. Do you have any indication of, are these normal fluctuations, or is there any particular reason why we would have sort of? And I wanted to ask a question about that too, because it's not altogether clear for me. Are those numbers traffic stops, including ones where we would have given a verbal warning? Or a warning, whatever. I want to actually make a distinction between whether or not we're giving people warnings and letting them go and not entering it into the system versus a formal warning versus a ticket. And maybe you can help us understand that and why the numbers might have jumped so dramatically between 2018 and 2019, at least to a layperson like me.
I'm not sure if they jumped that much. It might have been 4,800 stops, but not 48%. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's, let me see. In 2019, there were 13,745 moving violations issued, up 48.3% from the 9,271 issued in 2018.
I don't know the answer to that, other than the fact that there may have been more staff through hiring. I don't know that though, but I will tell you, over the years, we were averaging over 20,000 stops for a long period of time, and they've been declining.
Okay.
But I can inquire to see what the chief currently thinks caused that increase, and I'll see if I can find the answer for you.
That'd be great. On that piece around, are we capturing all stops in our data? Meaning, are there circumstances where an officer might stop someone and just say, "Hey, I just want to give you a heads up. I'm not even going to put this in the system, but if you can be a little bit more careful next time, please do that." Is that something that's not being captured in the data that we have?
That has been the short answer is no. And all along, people kept trying to get various police departments to commit to recording those type of stops. I never felt that I could come out and publicly say that we are recording them totally, because I think it's impossible to track, number one, impossible to account for all of the stops. And, so I don't think I know that is not done. I know we've tried it, and I know that the numbers are so small, we know it's not going on. And I'll give you an example of how that may happen. A person could be pulled over for making the illegal left turn in Coolidge Corner. The cruiser pulls him over, the officer steps out of the car and immediately gets a call. So that car's got to get let go. They'd probably walk up to the car, you pulled an illegal left turn, I got to go, here's your break, see you later, and they leave. And that's it. I've done that. I know that every officer in there has probably done it in multiple times. So no, those stops like that are not recorded. They're not recorded. That we felt that we could get the accurate data on traffic stops that are documented, and they're documented through that citation that is issued.
Right. Yeah, I'm wondering if if there's an officer, let's call them Officer Bad Apple, that is conducting a pretextual stop, meaning they've got some other suspicion, although not reasonably founded, they find someone suspicious, use a traffic stop to discover whether or not that person is actually doing anything illegal or has done anything illegal, finds out that the answer is no, and they just let them go on their way and don't record that as a stop. I mean, that's certainly possible if we're not recording every stop, right?
Right, right. But no officer should be pulling somebody over for a hunch. I mean, if the person commits a violation, yeah, they can be stopped. You know, that's my feeling. You just shouldn't do that.
Okay.
Do they get pulled over for a traffic stop to make an inquiry into something? Yeah, that happens. But they committed that violation. It's up to the officer to have the discretion whether he or she wants to issue a ticket, and what the kind of ticket it is.
Great. All right, let's I've taken up a lot of space. Let me do this. I know Mikey had your hand up, but I think Chi-Chi and Alexander want to weigh in on this line, and then we'll get to you, Mike. So Chi-Chi, go ahead.
Hi, yes, Chief. I was part of the discussion we had yesterday at the departmental analysis meeting, and it was the fact that I put something in my section of the report about traffic stops and race that you pointed out, the motorists going through Brookline aren't all residents. I wanted to get some more definitive feedback on what you think is a fair population for comparison. I felt, we had to cut that discussion short because of timing. You mentioned a 2009 study, if we could get cites to that. You mentioned maybe a couple other studies. The other thing I can do is look at the population of adjoining communities like Alston Brighton, Fenway, Jamaica Plain. But I think it would be helpful if we could have somewhat more agreement on what we're going to use as the numerator or the denominator.
Okay, that's the $1,000 question, $1 million question, whatever. I think that's up for discussion, and I think that you as the committee have to weigh in on that because you're representing the community. I just want to make sure that it's not something that's going to tie us down to a census population only. I think what's fair is that we pick an area like you're saying, and I think if we can do that, then we should get somewhat of an accurate accounting or comparisons.
Okay,
I
well,
don't think you can.
let's get.
No.
Can we do this? Can you have someone send us the sites for the studies that you've been talking about? Because I can't find them with a quick internet search. And if not, I'll just go ahead and use populations of adjoining communities.
Okay. The sites and the Northeastern study, I left it behind at work.
Yeah, you don't have to do it right now, obviously.
Okay. Probably the adjoining communities, that's fine, but we'd have to define it as the adjoining communities in Brookline's, population, because I think I'm going in my own mind, is that going to be the fairest way? And I think if we define, like you say, what we're actually taking into account, people can make their minds up if that's accurate or not. Because I don't think we're going to find one that is truly accepted across the board. Just because you can't, you don't know who's coming through town here. You don't know who's driving through. And like I said, there's a lot of traffic coming through. But I think that's probably a good place to start, knowing that you're going to get pushback.
Okay.
Dan, along with that, can you share with us the methodology for the 2009 study? You mentioned that was the last time we conducted a study. I'd love to see. I mean, maybe I can just find it, but if you do have it and can share it with the task force, I think that'd be helpful for us to all take a look at that.
I will ask them to look for it at work.
Okay.
And if not, we could probably go down and call. I know Amy Farrell and Jack McDevitt, two people that did the study at Northeastern. So, and Amy Farrell, I think I know she was the the overseer of the whole thing. So if we don't have it in the station, we'll try to get it out in Northeastern.
Okay, great. Alexander.
I have sort of two pieces here, one of which is a question for Chief O'Leary, and one of which is just sort of a bit of a comment on something that he said earlier that's more like public education for the task force and for any attendees. So just really quickly, Chief O'Leary, and maybe you said this before and I missed it, and if so, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the 2018 and 2019 FAIP spreadsheets here. For the column about arrests, is this accounting for arrests as a result of a traffic stop? Or is this arrest as a result of a traffic stop where the arrest was specifically for a traffic related violation? And this is purely because like I'm looking at the whatchamacallit, the citation data spreadsheet, and it's just like the statute number, and I haven't, gone and Googled what did the statutory citations actually relate to. So I guess is that only traffic violations, or is that all arrests as a result of a traffic stop? Like say you pull somebody over for having a busted taillight, but the arrest is actually because they're smoking a joint like while sitting in the driver's seat.
In answer to your first question, that packet number 5 is the breakdown of all the chapter and sections of citations. So you don't have to go looking for it. It's all right in there, all that information.
Thank you.
Okay. And then the second thing, your question on, that is the arrest based on a traffic stop, meaning you could get pulled over for a red light. You could have a revoked license plus an arrest warrant. That is the data that we're getting now. And the reason it's taken some time is that there's about 150 arrests over the 2-year period based on the traffic stops. So what Neil Harrington has to do is pull everyone, arrest report, go through the arrest report and document what all of the charges were. So by the 4th, you'll have the information that say maybe 50 of those were traffic offenses that led to the stop, and an arrest warrant was discovered on a check of the offender. And you'll have that documentation. Did I?
I'm sorry, that was a little bit unclear. What were you saying we'll have the documentation of?
The documentation to find out whether that arrest, what the exact charges were in that arrest, have to be pulled and reviewed by hand.
Okay.
They're all based on the stop though. They're all based on that ticket. If you got pulled over and you only get charged with a speeding violation or a red light violation, and then you're marked as an arrest, well, you probably had something on your record that allowed the officer to make the arrest. And we'll find that information out for you.
Okay. So we're finding out the other charges related to that particular arrest.
That's correct. It's just taking time because it's pulling info by hand.
No worries. Okay, thank you for that. And then this next bit, this is actually not a question for you, Chief O'Leary, but more of a comment for everybody else about something that you said earlier. When it comes to, so Raul, you were asking of like, can an officer pull somebody over on a hunch? And Chief O'Leary said that doesn't happen and cannot happen. And I just want to share kind of my experience. And I recognize very limited experience in criminal defense work. But I think virtually any criminal defense attorney will agree with me when I say that the way that officers pull people over on a hunch is through a traffic violation, because this is how criminalization works. This is how criminal law works. You can be like, absolutely anybody can be arrested at some point for doing anything if you follow them for long enough, because of the way that like criminal law is so all broad and all encompassing. Everybody does something that is against the law at some point in the course of their lives, particularly if they're behind the wheel of a car. Somebody's going to be speeding. Somebody's going to roll through a red light instead of a stop. you're gonna have a busted taillight and get pulled over. And it's also true. So like in addition to that, you can and will get pulled over for any kind of reason. So what an officer might do, and this happens in criminal cases, it could be, imagine a situation where you recognize the car, or there's a black guy in the front seat, and you say, I'm going to follow this car until they do something wrong. And then they do something wrong, the car gets pulled over for a totally legitimate reason, right? That's how the hunch can work. And then it's also true that like a number of the thing to always to remember, and no offense here to Chief O'Leary, is that it's incredibly easy for a police officer, even if as easy as it is to like manufacture a reason to pull somebody over in this way, it's also incredibly easy for an officer to lie, to say, I saw a busted taillight. And then when you're talking with your client 2 days later, they say, I don't have a busted taillight. I've never had a busted taillight. And I took it to the shop immediately after this, and the taillight was not busted. I've talked with colleagues where this has been the conversation, where an officer said that there was an unusual flickering pattern in the brake light and described the pattern that sounded like Morse code, and they took it to the shop and there was nothing. So there's a lot of ways in which this can play out that I wanted to kind of do a bit of like public education on this, because I think that that process is not always well understood. And again, no particular comment on you, Chief O'Leary here. Just want to kind of...
No, but I just like to say, I didn't say it didn't happen. I said it should not happen. And I said that. And I think that any officer that performs their duties in that manner is not doing the right job. And they're probably in it for the wrong reasons. But I also did say, and I think that if there is I know that if there is a traffic violation that takes place, yeah, that person can be legally pulled over. And what happens after that is up to the court.
Right, and that's sort of exactly the point that I'm making. That it's.
I can see that, but just in context, what your experience is around the area, but you know that's, or what we read in the papers, is one thing, and maybe what happens in Brookline is a different thing.
Okay.
Now I'm going to bring a lot. I'm probably going to get a lot of comments on this too, but I will tell you that those 2 years we had no formalized citizen complaints of people that were mistreated based on a traffic stop. Now I know people will turn around and say, "Well, people are afraid to make a complaint," but the system's in place to make a complaint against the officer. We got no complaints 18 and 19 based on a traffic enforcement.
So Chief O'Leary, just quickly, so this was not a question that was directed at you, and
I understand that. I just want to show another side to it. I mean,
sure. And I just also, I think there's a bit of, and I think this is happening in every community where we're having this conversation. And I know we saw some of this at the public meeting of like, well, maybe that happens elsewhere, but it doesn't happen here. Of like, this is how, we'll all be standing around complaining about how much we hate the U.S. Congress, but everybody keeps reelecting their own representatives because our guys are doing okay, but it's all the other guys who suck. At a certain point, you got to recognize that there are patterns that exist across systems. This is one of them. This is just how it works. It happens here because it happens everywhere.
I think that is one of the reasons why we had such robust training on making the proper stops, making anti-bias training, unconscious bias training, and then we released all these statistics. So I think that in a way recognized that this stuff goes on, and we try our best to make sure it doesn't occur.
Yeah, I'll just say, just adding further context, I mean, we have talked about the idea that there are myriad reasons why people don't wouldn't file a complaint. And also, we've explored today the idea that that the possibility does exist that an officer could conduct a stop that they know was either unlawful or not what they were trained to do. And it's possible that stop not even be captured in the system because they're not required to necessarily put every stop in the system if they're not going to take action. So I think we're just getting all the facts here, and I think these are all things that we need to consider as we go forward. I did want to give Mike an opportunity to jump in.
I'll say one quick sentence about what Alexander was just talking about. I have a daughter who is a public defender. She's worked in Norfolk County, and now she's in Suffolk, in Roxbury and West Roxbury District Court. And she would say exactly the same thing as Alexander has said. We've had many discussions about it, and Brookline is part of Norfolk County. So there are a lot of suburban towns in that was her first assignment. The question I have is on the citation document. In the citation documentation, there are arrests, and then there's court, somewhat larger number for criminal application court. And what we're trying to establish here is how useful is it to have the police doing traffic enforcement from a crime prevention perspective, or in terms of apprehending criminals. So you stop somebody and you find that they have a warrant, and you take some action. So the number of arrests is about 5% of the total stops. What's that criminal and application / court reference to?
Mike, you got cut out. I didn't hear your question, your entire question.
I'm sorry. On the citation disposition, what's the difference between arrests and criminal application court? That category.
Arrest is the person's taken into custody.
Yeah.
Criminal application is that there's summons in the court based on the offense that was made. It's a more. There was actually three categories that a person has to respond to. The arrest, obviously.
Yeah.
Then there's the civil infractions, which are like red lights, speeding, stop sign violations, things like that. Then the criminal application is the more, like I described it as an example, leaving the scene of an accident, having an uninsured vehicle, operating a revoked license. Those things you'll be given a ticket, and you'll have 4 days to respond, and you'll get summons into court if you don't resolve the ticket.
Right. And the criminal application, is there any way of differentiating between a criminal application or court disposition that was related to the traffic violation versus something that was determined once the stop was made? Or are those typically related to what's found, what the officer finds out about the person after the stop?
We wouldn't use the motor vehicle citation to record something that did not apply to the stop. So if other things were found, say something was found in the car and they were charged in court, you'd have to review the arrest report. That would not be documented on the citation. If they don't have the insurance for the car, if their car is revoked, if they left the scene of an accident, things like that you have to charge based on the citation, and that you're legally required to do that.
Okay.
So the offense all of these are based on the motor vehicle citations that are issued by the police.
Yes.
This information.
Yeah. Okay.
But again, if we wanted to try to track something like that's not an arrest, it would be extremely difficult. You'd have to go through all the reports, which, maybe you can get it out of the court system. I don't know.
Okay.
Ann?
Yeah, quickly, I just want to say thank you, Alexander, for the public education part of what you said. And just to add to that, when we look at data around field interviews or field investigations, that whole process becomes even more complicated, hard to suss out in terms of what makes a person suspicious in stopping a person and interviewing a person in a field interview. Where you may have a flickering taillight that's doing weird things, yes or no, is one issue. But in terms of how a person is being stopped for a field interview, that criteria gets even murkier in terms of everything that Alexander brought up. And I just want to put that out there because we're also looking at field interviews, right?
Okay. One thing, well, I think you mentioned about prevention. A belief that I've always had is that if you have an active police department and people actually see officers during their work schedules, work days, and doing work, I think that is a form of prevention. I think if somebody has a criminal activity in mind and then sees the officers out actually doing their work or in an area of town in the middle of Coolidge Corner out walking around, they might think twice about doing a crime. So I think that if your question was, is traffic activity on the part of a police department help prevent crime, I'd say that yes, there is a part that does that, because to see a community that has an active police force, I think is a benefit to the residents, and probably does keep crime down, because it's like anything else. If somebody's going to go to try to break into a house and the house is all locked up and there's an alarm on it, but the house next door doesn't have a thing for an alarm and is not locked up, they're going next door.
Let me ask you a couple more questions about the data that we have before us. Well, first of all, I was looking at some of the data around stops related to speeding, and let me ask you this first before looking at the data: is how are officers instructed to address speeding? I mean, I think it'd be obvious that if someone was going 50 miles over the speed limit, that they would be stopped, and that's clearly reckless driving. But not so obvious that 5 miles over the speed limit would constitute a stop. What's our standard?
I'll speak for myself. When I was doing traffic enforcement, and I'll use Beacon Street as an example, we used to set up a radar just before rush hours or during rush hours, around 1465 Beacon Street, just before Marion. Marion Street, once you come down off of that hill and you head in towards Marion Street, go on Beacon Street heading towards Harvard, there's a lot of traffic and there's a lot of people crossing the street. The speed limit there is 30 miles an hour. It was 30 miles an hour. I used to set the radar at 42, so you wouldn't pull anyone over until they were going 42 miles an hour, understanding that there was a hill. I never publicized that. I'm doing it now. But that would probably constitute a warning. Anything higher over 48 would probably constitute a complaint. But I was never given instructions on how to do that. But I think what I did is I looked at where I was doing the radar trap, whether it was in an area like that or on a street like Babcock Street, which is more of a residential street. Right. So I don't think anybody should pull anybody over for 5 miles an hour, going 5 miles an hour a little faster. But you get 10, 12 miles an hour above the speed limit, yeah, you should be stopped and reeled in a little bit. And that doesn't mean you have to give them a citation, a court complaint, but maybe you should give them a warning.
Right. And all those speeds, are those captured on the citation itself? I believe so, right?
Yes.
Right. So if we want to look at sort of the average speed when someone is stopped, that's something we could certainly look at.
Yes. And it's on there because that's how the fine is assessed. It's assessed based on how fast you are going above the speed limit. And that's assessed by law.
And certainly not all stops are, I wouldn't expect them to be, not all stops are captured on radar. I mean, some of those are best estimate.
Yes.
Right. Okay. wanted to show, I was looking at the data you sent, and I'll just share a screen really quickly. And one of the things I wanted to show was, I looked at these categories 9017 and 9018, and maybe as I show these, you can explain what these categories are, like what they're both speeding is my understanding, but maybe you can break that down a little bit further for us.
No, they're both speeding. I used to know the difference. I don't.
Okay.
I'm guessing it. I don't know.
All right, no problem. When I looked at the legend, it looks like 9017 is your typical speeding stop, and that 9018 is maybe in a special area where the speed limit's particularly lower. I don't know if speeding in a construction zone or a school zone might be captured in that too, but maybe a worse version of a stop of speeding. And so one of the things I looked at here were what we see here. This is a civil infraction, and so this is when someone gets a ticket. Is that right?
A ticket that's you have to pay a fine.
Right. So a ticket where you have to pay a fine. And this category where there's always, and everywhere we see this, and I'm glad to see this, that in every category, it seems our officers are more likely to give a warning than a ticket. And I'm okay with that. I think warnings are often good enough. We just want people to correct their behavior. And, I think that's fine. I don't think we need to ticket someone every time they violate one of these rules. So what I did was I looked at the percentage of those who are ticketed versus the total number who are stopped, which is in this grand total category. And then you have them broken down here by race, so the system does. And so when we looked at the percentage stopped, we see about, and what I didn't include in this is because there's some dispute, as we talked about earlier, about what the denominator should be, right? Whether or not 58% of stops for speeding, this particular type of speeding, are white motorists, whether or not that's higher or lower than we might expect it to be, right? Certainly the number of white residents in Brookline is much higher. It's almost 80%, but let's just leave that aside for a minute. So according to the data I see here, 58% of those motorists stopped for speeding in this category are white. And of those white motorists stopped, 27% received a ticket versus a warning. When we look at the top category up here, only 7% of motorists in Brookline, again, this is in 2019, were stopped for this category of speeding, identify as Asian, and 44% of those folks who were stopped who are Asian received a ticket versus the 27% of those stopped as white. And you'll see when you look down the different categories, Black, Middle Eastern, Latinx, certainly in this category, white folks are the least likely when stopped, even though are the preponderance of folks stopped are the least likely to get a ticket after being stopped. When we looked at the other category, we see very similar numbers here, and 59%, this is the more serious speeding category, I believe, and 59% of those stopped for this category are white. 42% of them receive a ticket, and the numbers go up and up and up as you look at the various non-white populations. And so I'm just wondering if there's any analysis, because one of the things that when we talk about, stops is that we'll hear officers say things like, we don't always know the race of the person that we've stopped until after. We don't get a good look or anything like that. And I can understand it might be difficult to tell, and certainly an Hispanic person like myself, a Latinx person like myself from a white person from maybe further away potentially, right? But these are cases when the stop has already occurred, when interaction has already occurred with the driver, with the motorist. And, when the ticket is being issued, we also capture race data. My understanding is to the best ability that the officer can tell. So I'm just wondering, these seem to be, meaningful discrepancies here, looking at large numbers. And I haven't gone through all of the rest of the categories I look forward to. But I'm wondering if you can provide us any sense of analysis on these numbers.
I'd just be guessing, to be honest with you. I mean, it depends on I would say maybe you look, and I think it's too late to do this, look in the nature of the violation and where it took place. But I mean, that's probably impossible to do at this point.
I mean, and certainly we're looking at big data here, right, or bigger numbers here. So if there was one circumstance where one white person was given a warning versus being ticketed, and an Asian person was giving a ticket versus a warning, we can look at those circumstances. But here we are looking at the totality of the stops in these two categories, and unless there's something particularly heinous about or beyond the scope of the law of the driving of non-white motorists versus white motorists. I mean, they've all been stopped. So clearly the officer has determined that a stop needs to occur. And they're all within the same category. And there's a separate category for those more sort of the more excessive versions of these stops, but we still see these disparities. I don't know, maybe there isn't an answer, but I think I think it's important to look at this, because as we tell, the annual report doesn't show any of these data, any of the ones that are in these categories highlighted here. We don't see that in the annual report, and I think that's something that is missing currently, and certainly something that we need to address in our stops. I'm going to stop sharing now and see if others have questions or thoughts.
Well, I just saw a question by Malcolm in the chat. And Malcolm, I can answer that. No, we don't ask them their race. And that goes back a long time. That was kind of what police officers were told to do. Don't ask for a race, because people don't want you to ask asking their race. Either that, or people don't. If we're going to keep stats like this, they want the officer's perception of the person that stopped, not ask the person what their race actually is. So that's how we put it, because they have to mark down on the citation the race and sex of the offender.
Eitan?
So I just wanted to ask Chief O'Leary a question. So look, obviously, like in every domain, we see racial bias when we study it. Doctors prescribing painkillers differently to white and black people, judges providing different sentences, referees on a basketball court. There's been a lot of research about discrimination in referees in NBA games. And actually, Michael Lewis, the author, has done a lot of work on studying referees in different domains of life. And, take the NBA as an example, the evidence is crystal clear. And in all of these stories, generally, the more you inform the referee in any situation, the less biased they become, the more aware of their bias that they are. They say, okay, I got to correct it. And you see that in the NBA. You see it, when this became a known thing about prescription medicine. The question I have is, like, when you see something like the statistic that Raul just provided, where it's like even conditional on the stop, you see this difference. I'm trying to understand the psychology of the police department or an officer looking at this data, how much resistance there is to like their existence of bias here. Where we know there's existence of bias in every single other domain of refereeing, and whether whether there's like a feeling like this is probably not a problem, and it's just the data is not showing us the truth. I want to know, like in the bias training that you do, I guess, when you see a number like that, is it a cause of concern or is it not? How much resistance is there? In other words, all of the evidence from every other domain of life suggests that if we provide a lot more evidence about what police officers are doing, this will correct bias, because it's going to make every police officer, whenever they pull someone over, think about it more. What's your take on that, or how do you think the police as a referee in this worldview differs from other domains in terms of what the data would show them or how they would react to the data?
Well, what I think the way to look at it is when we have our supervisors review the numbers, they review it based on the individual officer's performance. So out of the numbers that was just shown, we have 100 officers assigned to patrol division and traffic division, a little bit more than 100 officers, if it's fully staffed, that stop cars as part of their normal routines. So I think when we look at a person's statistics, we see what we make a judgment whether that is out of the norm, and we have a discussion. It's brought to that person's attention. I don't think we ever looked at it the way Raul just showed it, where you take it one category and you look at the whole category and then you address it to the whole department that this is what you're doing. Life's a learning experience. I never thought to do it that way, but we did do it based on, percentages and individual offices and that way. And I agree with you. You can't change any person's habit without making a continual effort to make the change. That's why the anti-bias training is not just one in-service round of in-service training and then we're cured and that's it. That's not the way life is.
Do you have a sense of what, if we're all trying to find this standard, which is equal treatment, do you have a suggestion about what that would look like? I mean, we want the same person pulled over who's doing the same action, no matter the race, to be treated equally. And obviously, we're struggling to come up with a baseline to evaluate the data. How would we know if we're right if we're seeing some disproportional being pulled over or ticketing or whatever? Do you have a suggestion, or do you have any sense of how an officer ought to think about that when they're in the field?
Well, I think that's a hard thing to do on a consistent basis, because the officer is making the stop, should be making the stop, not based on the occupant of the car, but on the actions that person took. And, so that's number one. But then number two, when you're trying to balance percentages and balance numbers, you want the officer to do the work, to do his or her decision based on the actions, right? Not based on a conversation with the person afterwards or what the person looks like. But then it's difficult to capture that when you're looking strictly at numbers. And I'll give an example. You pull somebody over late at night, you can't see in the car. You don't know who's operating the car, but they were going down Route 9 at 75 miles an hour. Now, should you give that guy or that woman a ticket? Yeah. Well, what if they're African American? Is that going to go against them? What if they're white? Is that going to, we're dealing with humans, and we're human, and it's not an exact science. And I don't know if anybody can accurately answer that, because you're looking at the activity that's taken place, and you're supposed to judge it on that. And I don't know am I making sense? I know what I'm trying to say, but I don't have an answer for you.
Yeah, I guess I would just say that, like, because it's sort of the same story in multiple domains, where you present someone with data saying there's a bias, and the first reaction is kind of kicking and screaming, saying, no, there's not, you don't understand it. And then there's more data, like, okay, there actually is bias. And then that data helps people correct it. It seems to me, just, I don't know, I'm not saying this about Brookline in particular, but with policing, there is a lot more kicking and screaming than in other domains.
I don't want to get into a philosophical discussion, but maybe not. Maybe there's other professions that kick and scream too.
I think there are. Look, I know there are. I've studied this on the physician side, and trust me, physicians don't think they're biased, and you give them enough data, and they there's no, there's nothing to do but face it. Okay, sorry. I'll yield the floor. I think that I guess I'm hoping that there will be a common acknowledgement of what the data show and that there's a problem to address I guess I just think the similarities in all these domains are worth remembering. Okay, I'll see the floor.
I think, I don't disagree with that at all. And I would hope that part of these committees, both committees working, would come up with some suggestions on how the community thinks the police should go about doing it. I mean, I think that's important. I know when I released these statistics on a lot of different occasions, I didn't give my opinion as to what everything was, and I would ask the community to take a look at the statistics and see what they feel about them, and if they're comfortable with them. Maybe now's the time to get some feedback to the department on it, because the department wants to do the right thing. And the town, I'm sure, and the town wants the department to do the right thing. So now I threw that back on you guys.
Yeah, I think this is one of those areas where, I'm finding, when I, this idea you mentioned sort of that as far as like this kind of data sharing doesn't take place with the entire department or as part of trainings, at least not in the way that we're discussing today. I think that at a minimum would be an important step forward. I saw some hands. I see Bonnie, and then we get Kristen. Good, Bonnie.
I just want to point out also that these numbers are present within this current system of enormous bias training, right? This is 2019, 2018, and these are the numbers. So bias training isn't working. That's just my comment. That's what I gather. When we look at the numbers and everyone says, okay, take this back to the bias training and add A, B, and C to it. How much is there to add, and how many hours can you have someone sitting in front of however these bias trainings happen before we realize that they don't work?
Well, another side of the coin is, what would the department look like if there was no bias training?
Well, I think this is the problem. To remove the danger of bias, we may have to remove points of contact because it's not possible. It's a possibility.
Well, then you have to eliminate bias from the entire human race.
That's correct. That's correct, which isn't possible, or at least not in anytime soon. But this is the point where, when you have an officer that has the ability to detain someone, to arrest someone, incarcerate them, or to physically handle them, or God forbid, injure them with their weapons, this is the point where we bump up against it, because there isn't, we haven't found a solution to eliminate bias. So that's where the rubber hits the road right there. Just to put that out there. I don't know. Yeah, I guess that's my whole comment.
Okay. I'll just add, to that, well, two things. One is, it's a saying, important not to confuse action for progress, right? So we can do things, but we have to measure those things and see if they're actually working, right? And if they're not, then we need to do different things. The other thing is pulling from the conversation that Eitan had with Dan earlier is, it's, if we're going to start to eliminate these touch points, as Bonnie mentioned, in areas where bias can occur, I imagine one of those places would be in the health profession. Another place would be in with respect to law enforcement, much more than, let's say, referees, right? I mean, I'm definitely concerned about bias in refereeing. I'm much more concerned about bias in policing and in the health professions and other important areas. So So I think that's why it's so critical that we do more in this space than we're doing in other spaces to root it out. Kristen.
Yeah, I wanted to thank both Alexander and Eitan for the lines of inquiry that just opened up for all of us, because I think that those are particularly important. The thing that I wanted to say as well about the experience of a traffic stop, and I'm going to keep coming back to this refrain over and over, is that we're also talking about legitimacy. I don't know if my connection is breaking up or not. But
yeah, just so you know, we could hear you. It's a little choppy.
Stopped,
yeah, you may want
to feel like the experience of being stopped is legitimate. All right. The point that I was making earlier is I understand what Chief O'Leary is talking about. If I'm going down Route 9 at 75 miles an hour, a traffic stop feels legitimate. I know what I was doing. Other instances where I come in contact with law enforcement, I think there's then a question of people want to feel like the system has legitimacy when I then am brought in contact with law enforcement. And I think when we go through just taking a quick look at the data that you just hustled up, Raul, on that spreadsheet, that I think calls into question whether or not I don't feel legitimacy looking at those numbers. I don't feel legitimate, and that was not an in-depth analysis that you needed to do to come to something that suggests that legitimacy is something that we need to take into account when that people are feeling like the system that they're participating in confers that legitimacy. So a little bit inelegant in the point, but I wanted to lift up that all sides of this equation need to end up with people also feeling like the system that you are coming into contact with has to have legitimacy.
Thanks, Kristen. Kimberly, I know you've been waiting. Please go ahead.
I have a lot of thoughts, and they may be like all over the place because I've kind of just been listening a lot. One, the thing that Chief said about 75 miles an hour going down Route 9, to me, it's just not, please don't take me personal, Mr. O'Leary, please don't. I feel like that's not really a good example of like how policing, and because it's a no-brainer, 75 miles an hour, of course you're gonna pull someone over, right? But also I could be and drive down Route 9 a lot and it's kind of lit up. As a Black woman, I often wonder if I'm passing a police, if I'm gonna get pulled over just because of the color of my skin. I could be driving through Brookline, and again, late at night, if I'm coming from Boston or coming from somewhere and I'm driving, I'm like, oh, there's a police. I wonder if they're gonna turn around and pull me over just because of the color of my skin. Also, going back to what Alexander was talking about with like hunches, right? And I see it every day. The field that I work in every day for over 20 something years, I see it every day. People get pulled over because of the color of their skin and how the police hide it, or I don't say hide it. Oh, they had a tail light out. Oh, they didn't use their signal. I know when police are following me, now I'm like this. I'm super nervous. Am I gonna get pulled over? They follow me long enough, I'm gonna get pulled over. All right, my last thing. Not my last thing, second to the last. Thinking about the numbers and how they look. We can train people all day on bias, right? Every day. But at the end of the day, they're still gonna have it. It's kind of like who we are, assumptions, biases, all that, right? When all these numbers come in and the officer has arrested or pulled over 15 people of color, do you look at that? Do you then say, let me pull him into the office and say, what's going on here? Like, we have to address it how we see it. And this last thing, and I might get kicked off the task force for this, but just a feeling that I have, Chief O'Leary. You're no longer on the force, right? And sometimes it really feels like you're trying to protect the force instead of like being really super honest about what the numbers say about what we see. And I feel like why are we trying to protect people, or who? Like, why can't we just be honest in this space and do the work and get it done? And I'm done.
Well, I'll address the last one. I mean, I know my role here, and I try not to do that. I think when I talked and answered the questions this morning, I was doing it honestly from my perspective. I think my last conversation with Etan, I said that I hope things come out of this committee to tell us what you want us the police department to do. If you feel that I'm more protective of the police department than I should be, I apologize. But I also think that I try to keep an open mind, and I try to tell you how I did it, because I was chief there for 23 years. Hey, what can I say? I don't know. I don't know what else to say.
I apologize if it felt like I'm not trying to insult you. I'm just saying that oftentimes, not just today, but oftentimes when we bring up a point and then you come back with this, like, for me, it feels like protecting the police force that doesn't need to be protected, and you're no longer on that force, and you don't have to, you don't gain anything from protecting them. Let's just, like, we see the numbers, we see what it is, and let's just be honest about it and just get the work done. And I appreciate you being here. I'm not saying that. I just wanted to feel like more, you said open, I appreciate more open-mindedness.
Well, I do try to provide a perspective that of the police officer. I mean, I think that's part of my role too, but I don't know, what can I say? We'll see what the future brings.
Right. Thanks, Kimberly. Malcolm.
Thank you. So I'm really trying to stay focused after what Kim said, because that, in particular, resonates with me as a Brookline resident, like she is. And I won't go down sort of a spiral of the times I've been stopped or other things, but I really wanted to comment particularly around training, which I think is very important. What has always been very unclear for me is the role of evaluation and therefore promotion within relation to those trainings. And I say that really from the capacities I know myself best as a teacher and as a coach, right? And so, something to me that actually isn't, sort of groundbreaking, even though when I played and coached, it felt that way. As a coach, I try to put in a game plan, and I can say I put in a game plan and then it doesn't work. I have to look in the mirror and say, I guess what? I didn't actually instill the game plan well, or maybe the game plan had a fault. And I think about that as a teacher, right? I can easily say, no, I taught the kids, I gave them readings, I gave them lectures, I gave them this, and they still failed the test. And I have to look in the mirror as a teacher and say, that's my fault. I clearly didn't teach it well enough where my students could retain it and do well on the test, right? Because the test is the evaluative measure. The game in sports is the evaluative measure. And I don't hear that from the Brookline Police. So I hear about all these trainings, and then we see this data, right? And so I don't hear the accountability of saying, well, clearly we're not getting the evaluative measure we want, right? And so perhaps there is some language that needs to be put in that perhaps we could get some help getting the union to concede, because what I often hear is things like, well, and I've heard this from select board on numerous things, like, for numerous years, well, we couldn't push back because the union has this rule that if you have X number of things and you pass the test, that means you get promoted, right? Not whether something is in their evaluation that may actually limit it. And one of the things I pushed on, not with Raul, mostly because he hasn't been there long enough and we haven't had these conversations, but other select board members is, the select board could actually take a moral authority and say, no, you have X, Y, Z in your jacket. And like, you don't get to be promoted until we can see your evaluative measure is that you've decreased your bias in terms of your traffic stops or your field and interrogation stops and things like that. And I don't see that happening. I mean, there's an element that I don't know. I don't know. Like, I know what it is for me for teaching. I have to set these goals and I have to meet with my evaluator multiple times to see if I'm meeting those goals and provide evidence and then sit. Like, I don't know if the police has something like that. So that's my thing. I keep going back to, like, you know, again, I won't question the validity of the training itself. I'm looking at the outcome and whether that outcome actually impacts how we then see those officers, right? Like, and is race and is, like, I know the police officer, I mean, it's been pretty clear and pretty well documented how much the police have done with mental wellness in those kinds of interactions. And still, I don't know how much that enters into, like, the evaluation. And even perhaps, you know, saying to someone, well, you know what, you don't get to move up until we see different outcomes and measures. And what I think, I don't want to speak for Kim. I think what I feel when I hear Kim speak is that the police department puts these things out in this largesse and says, this is where we are. But the real is that I don't encounter the entire police department. I encounter those one or two officers who stop me. And more importantly, at this stage of my life and being in town, who stop my students. Like when they're running through the village to get back to school on time and somebody stops them because they look suspicious, because they're running back to BHS. And so that's the kind of thing that I'm ultimately worried about. How do we put these things into evaluative measures and then actually hold people accountable to their outcomes? And it's a thing about, I just really don't know. And that is not very front facing. Like, you know, I've known, you know, Lieutenant Pastor for a long time. Like, I grew up with one of her brothers. I know she comes from a big family, so I won't get into that. But, like, you know, I am happy to know that she's a lieutenant because I've known her for a long time, but I have no idea what she met with criteria to get through that besides passing a test and tenure and perhaps interview. I don't know what went through those evaluations to do that. And it's not very front facing. It's not easy to find or know or understand. And so, yeah, I think, you know, the thing I keep coming to is that, and I'm going to stop because I feel like I'm rambling now, but that's kind of where I'm at.
Well, just to let you know, early on, you did get promoted just by your mark. The marks ruled everything. I took it upon myself probably 10 or 12 years ago to challenge that. We're still limited in that we get 3 names from civil service that you have to choose from. But we put it out that we're no longer going to go by the marks. You're going to be judged on things like citizen complaints, your work ethic, your management of time, your use of sick leave, whether, you know, like unaccounted for sick leave. And we're going to go through interviews with the supervisors for these people. And then we're going to pick between the group of 3 that we're required to do by civil service. That resulted in grievances. We prevailed on the grievances, and we've been doing that for at least 10 years now. So it is out there that what gets looked at.
Well, but not to stop you, but how does that relate to the training? So, like, when you give this training, like I haven't heard that as a part of your evaluative measure for promotion. Like, is it just going, or do you actually look at what is essentially the test of the officer in relation to that training? Like, in other words, like if you're saying you don't break down these stops by racial identity per officer.
No, we do. We do.
So does that go into evaluation?
That's all part of the evaluation. Then that's all addressed by supervisors on a regular basis. We cannot do, it's by contract, we cannot give an evaluation. We cannot do a formal evaluation process in writing for anybody that's been there after their probationary period. That we tried to negotiate a couple of times, it was never successful. We do an informal thing in that we require our supervisors to sit down with the people that are assigned to them quarterly, and they go over things like their stops, their arrests, their use of sick leave, their performance, and that gets passed up through the chain. All that stuff is used when deciding whether to promote or not. But we're limited by by 3 based on their marks. You can't say Jen Pastor was number 4. She couldn't be considered. You have to fall in those top 3.
Okay. I want to see if we can get in. I'm just mindful of the time right now. Let's get Chi-Chi in here. I know we have a comment in the Q&A that I would like to respond to, and I see Bonnie, and we'll see where we are. Chi-Chi.
Yeah, so I did have a question, but I feel like I need to acknowledge and respond to this conversation that Kimberly and Malcolm have raised, because it's, very profound. And I think it ties back to something that Eitan said about different professions and resistance to change, to having these issues pointed out, to making change in light of these issues. Chief O'Leary, I think, I think you are sort of an emblematic of a police culture that Eitan described that does have more resistance to it, and it's not the only one. So it's not you, it's not even the Brookline Police Department, it's policing and the culture of policing in general that makes it very tough to have an openness to acknowledgement of these issues and change. And it actually ties back to the Q&A about, why do we think if we move these functions to non-police personnel, to civilian personnel, there won't be bias? There will be bias. Everybody hasn't bias. It's the amount, it's the culture. Cultures have a lot of power that is never explicit. I work with, just to give you an example from my own work life, I work with credit bureaus, and they have like really intransigent cultures as well, and the way they act, and it comes from decades of behavior. And so what would be amazing, Chief O'Leary, is if you could break from that culture and, it's sort of, let's have an openness, to the ideas of shifting functions or shifting processes and procedures. The unions, police unions, certainly part of that. Heard a lot of criticism and some research on that as well. So my question, and you don't have to answer it, just to to throw something out there for thought on traffic enforcement, is all this talk about broken taillights makes me think, well, how does condition of the car figure into stops? I mean, we know there's obviously economic disparities between whites, blacks, Latinx, and Asian consumers, and that would translate into new cars and what condition they might be in. So that was just a thought I had in this discussion.
Maybe we get a brief response, Dan?
No, nothing's brief.
Please.
Yes. If we see that an officer makes too many of those vehicle problem stops, they get called on it. We have noticed that. In my own knowledge, one particular officer was citing too many people for equipment violations, and they were brought in and explained to them that that's not how we wanted to operate. They only had to be called in once. So that is an acknowledgement that the department makes when reviewing statistics. They look at equipment violations. Yeah,
I'd be interested to see, if I don't imagine this was the case, but if we saw something like that and recognized that there was, that whether it's related to racial bias or anything else, that an officer was doing something other than what we expected that they do, and that people were stopped and maybe ticketed unfairly, whether or not we reached back out to those folks, refunded the ticket with our apologies. I don't imagine that's something we've done, but I'd be curious to see if that's something that we can possibly do going forward. Bonnie.
I want to point out that when as someone experiencing this and experiencing Kim's comment, Malcolm's comment, and the reaction to it, is that what must the internal complaint process be like if this is a public moment where a complaint is very directly being given, and then being told that that's not how we teach our officers, that's not the training they get. I just want to put that out there. That doesn't make me comfortable. And I know there's people trying to redesign that so it would be outside of the police department, but that's a stark moment for me when I hear someone, take the chance of putting themselves out there in front of the police department to convey their experience, and then to have it be not acknowledged and taken into consideration so openly. But also, and I'm receiving questions from outside of this, but it's my understanding that racial discrimination complaints from the public to the police department, there haven't been any of them that haven't been dismissed, right? Is that true?
Some of the complaints have been mediated.
What does that mean?
That means the person that filed the complaint and they complained about officers sat down and talked about what occurred.
But what was the result of that? Was the officer so I guess what I mean is,
mediated means if they've sat down and they talk about it and they're both comfortable with what the outcome was, it's left at mediated.
okay.
It's not an issuance of guilt or punishment.
Right. That fits into what I said. Like, there's no admission of, yes, this was racial bias. Correct.
It depends on what went on in the mediation session. I'm usually not privy to them.
Well, that would fall into guilt, I think. I'm asking a question for a viewer. So that
don't take this as me defending the police, but there are two sides to every story. And so you're asking me to say that somebody admitted they were guilty. I don't know that.
No, I'm asking if there was, well, I guess so. Yeah, I guess I'm asking or maybe if they didn't admit it, someone else on the force was like, yeah, you were out of line. That was racist discrimination.
I don't know what you want to say.
I think I'm just pointing out that's a statistic that, in the context of a complaint, this is a scenario where we're showing data, and I don't want to rehash what everyone else just said. We're showing evidence of bias, and also this also feels like a complaint process. And what I'm saying is this makes me very uncomfortable with the internal complaint process. And the pushback to racial bias that I'm seeing here, I'm equating that to to other complaints that have happened in the police department in the context of bias. That not only here is it being pushed back on, but also within the police department historically.
Okay, well, point taken. I just, part of my reasons for giving it another side of it is to let people know the efforts that the police department has done to reduce this. I think everybody, if you took it as me defending it, that it never takes place. I don't think I ever said that, but I did want people to know the efforts that the department goes to reduce it. I don't think that's defending the department in a wrong way. I just think that it's part of my role is to let people know what it is the department does. I'm told you before, we're not perfect, and it's not a perfect system, and policing's not perfect, but nothing's perfect. We're all human.
But I think a more welcome response would be, wow, I see that now.
I think I acknowledge that we didn't look at things that way.
It's not really.
If you talk about the Raoul statistic when he talked about the speeding, and I acknowledge that that's not how I thought to look at them.
Let me jump in here if I can. An important question, folks might be asking is why this conversation? Why is it so important to be looking at this? And I see there's a question or a comment in the Q&A about well, if we switch to a civilian enforcement agency, wouldn't we also have bias there too? Well, if we did nothing, if we just switched over to civilians and we did nothing different, then likely the answer is yes. But no, I don't think anyone's suggesting that. The balance that it seems to me we have here is on one side, we want to have some mechanism to ensure safety on the road, for one, right? People driving safely for the benefit of other motorists, pedestrians, cyclists, and others, right? And also, and this is where I think we'll have a larger conversation on this at our next meeting 2 weeks from now, the larger public safety, whether or not there's some benefit in addition to, stopping folks for things like running stop signs and speeding, especially excessive speeding, those kinds of things, whether or not there's a public safety benefit to engaging in additional investigative work as part of those stops, right? And that's on one side. And we're balancing that against all of the other concerns that we know exist, that the data show us exist, about bias and the related harmful impacts, some of which we've seen nationally, but also local impacts as well. It really comes down to, when you're looking at this, whether or not the benefits of our current model outweigh the drawbacks of our current model, which are obvious. They're obvious in the data. They've been obvious for a very long time, and they are particularly intractable. I mean, we've seen this as the chief points out for many, many years. And again, not to confuse action on these issues, and no one's denying that the department has taken certain actions to try to mitigate these issues, but not confusing action with progress. And we see that progress has not been made. So an essential question, it seems to me, is it possible to eliminate the kinds of negative effects of our current model without changing that model altogether? That is the work of this task force, is first of all to see, is it even possible? Many have tried. We've heard from our police department that they've implemented already most of the 8 Can't Wait and other reform policies, or working on other reform policies. There's been anti-bias training, and yet we still see these numbers, and they have not gone anywhere, and they show no signs of going anywhere, frankly. So a question for us is it possible to eliminate this type of bias under the current model? A second question for us, it seems to me, is there another model that can meet some of these safety goals, road safety, and to the extent necessary, public safety goals beyond the road, that meet those same goals without the same level of bias? Now, one important distinction here is that this isn't just about tickets. We've talked about a lot about stops and tickets in this conversation. But when it comes to bias, tickets and disproportionate ticketing versus warnings and other things that we've talked about are the canary in the coal mine. They're the thing that shows us that there's a larger problem out there. And we know what those larger problems are. They've been discussed extensively in this meeting. in these meetings. And that includes not just the worst possible thing that can happen, someone losing their life, and these are things that we've seen nationally, but also, the harmful effects of over-policing, of harassment, and the psychological effects, quite frankly, even when no one has put their hands on you or done anything else to you, when the state has not done that. Those are all those negative effects that under, a civilian traffic enforcement model would certainly be mitigated, if not eliminated. And then we can address those other issues of whether or not someone based on their race is more likely to get just a ticket for a violation that, as Alexander points out, most of us commit every day, if not every week, right? And certainly if we instructed our police officers or civilian force to stop everyone who violated the law every single time, that's all they would do. They'd be spending their entire days doing that. So, it seems to be we have this system right now, and I'm going to wait for the data on December 4th to make any final conclusions about this. But when we look at our justice system, one of the things that I think should be a principle of our system is that it's worth it to let 100 guilty people free to make sure that we don't put one innocent person away, right? It's absolutely worth it to do that. In our current model of traffic enforcement, to the extent that we're using it as a pretext for that second goal, the larger goal of public safety, not just road safety, to the extent that we're using it for that second goal, it seems that we're stopping many, many, many people who are not a threat to the larger public safety, in the name of maybe catching a few people who are. And we're going to, when we look at those data, we're going to have to consider that and whether or not it makes sense to approach traffic enforcement and public safety enforcement from that model moving forward. And it is the task, the charge, in fact, of this task force to come up with an alternative model. That's our job, to the extent that it meets public safety goals and makes the environment better for those most impacted by the issues that brought us here in the first place. So I just wanted to offer some framing as to why we're here, why we're talking about this, and what we hope to gain from it. We've got a few minutes left. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to say before we go? Mike.
Yeah, I want to tie together the perspective that Eitan gave about how if you take data and you show it to people, they respond. And Malcolm's comment about sort of on the ground, his on the ground comments, as it were. There's a habit that organizations have, and police departments no different in this regard, that they keep the data that they're asked to keep, and they don't look at it. And what Raul did with that little bit of analysis is look at the data and try to extract some meaning from it. And one of the purposes I think we can serve here, certainly the overview that Raul, that you just gave, is great, but one of the really great. But one of the purposes that we can serve here is to look at the data and say, this is what it means. For example, 5% of the traffic stops result in an arrest. Is that sufficiently high to justify having an armed police force do traffic stops? I don't have an answer to that, but that's what the data shows us, and we should be looking at the data to figure out what's actually going on, rather than simply saying, oh, they're keeping the data. Because the organization itself has a tendency to say, here's the data, we kept it, we followed the rules. I've seen this in industry, and it's amazing how unlikely it is that the organization itself will try to do what we're trying to do here.
Okay. Anyone else? All right. We're at 9:57, so I'll just say, appreciate that all the subcommittees are really starting to hit their stride now. I think we had some great interim reports that were issued last week. and look forward to more work in the days ahead. I'm tuning into meetings whenever I can, as often as I can, of the subcommittees, and I just want to say really appreciate all the really deep work that you all are doing on this. So as far as the full task force is concerned, we will take next Friday off for a break, for whatever break that is for you. And we will meet the following Friday. We'll continue this conversation with that deeper data that Mike was just talking about, and that we've asked Dan to run down for us. Thanks for doing that, Dan. And I think it's going to be really important to answer these questions, the questions I raised, the questions Mike raised, and the questions that have been raised by so many other folks on this particular call. I'll also at that point report, and know Chi-Chi's done some deep work on this in terms of looking at alternative models of traffic enforcement elsewhere. So we'll give Chi-Chi an opportunity to report on that. I'll talk about some conversations that I've had with city councilors in Cambridge, Mass, and Berkeley, California, both who are looking at alternative models to traffic enforcement. So I'll report on those at that meeting as well. Devin, I see you. You have some reminders or updates for us.
Thank you, Chair Fernandez. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to plug a quick reminder that your subcommittee pages are fully up and active. I am going to ask the chairs to take a look at them, perhaps over the weekend or the next couple of days, and just let me know what you'd like to see changed or populated in there. If you've created a Google folder, if you haven't created that, I can create folders internally in the back end of the website and then continue to populate your documents in there as they become available and you'd like them shared with the public. These pages are for your design and to really share your work directly with the public. So I want to make sure that they look and feel how you wish them to. So if you could take a look at those in the next couple of days and then send me whatever documents you think are missing, and as well as your minutes and agendas, which I'm updating as I receive them from you. And then my last plug is for the packet. We'll have a nice almost 2 week break before your next meeting. So if there is anything that you'd like included in the public packet, I usually like that 48 hours in advance of the meeting. I totally understand that you are constantly working on things. You all have a lot of full plates going on. So if you send it to me in less time than that, I will always make sure that it gets out there. We want to be sure that, folks who are watching can follow along. And I've noticed, especially when I'm uploading your recordings of these meetings to the town website, they're having high view counts. Anywhere from 50 to over 100 people are watching your meetings after the fact on YouTube. And so then I like to include the link to the packet so they can sort of reference the materials that you're talking about as they're watching. So feel free to communicate with me early and often if you have any questions about the website or your committee pages, as well as any other procedural things that need to be taken care of. I'm here to support you all.
Devin, thanks so much. We're all better for your support, this task force, the select board, and everyone else that benefits from your work. So thank you so much. Thank you to you all. I hope that you have, if you get a break, that you have a restful one. And please do be in touch with any questions you have. If you do have questions before our next presentation for Dan, I'd recommend sending them earlier than later. That way he can run down that information and have answers for us at the next meeting. But in the meantime, thank you all. Let's continue to do this important work. See you soon.